Welcome into 5 Wide Fantasy. Today we're getting into some must-add players heading into Week 14 of fantasy football. I've got 6 guys you can find on the waiver wire, including touching on some players that your league mates might forget about with bye weeks. We had 6 teams on bye last week. There's a couple of players from those teams that you might want to consider as well. Some of the latest injury news in fantasy football coming out of Week 13 as well we will cover. If you guys are new to the channel, hit that subscribe button. And as well, if you enjoyed today's video, get some value from everything we're talking about, hit that like button for me too. Let's get into these players. First up, paying attention to the injury report, Ezekiel Elliott, 40% rostered. We'll be covering everybody here, less than 50% rostered. Zeke is definitely a player that is probably one of the top ads on the week, but we'll get into a little bit of the schedule. You know, the Patriots are a team that are coming off being shut out, losing 6-0 to the Chargers. I am glad I did not get my eyes on that game very much yesterday, but Ramondre Stevenson's injury, an ankle injury, the team expects could sideline him for multiple weeks. So obviously, that's going to be an issue for him, and a positive note here for Zeke and the volume he should get in this offense that's getting some terrible quarterback play from Bailey Zappi and from Mac Jones. So final 4 weeks of the fantasy season, that's what we're going to be paying attention to, right? We've got the Pittsburgh Steelers, who are 22nd in fantasy points allowed to running backs, the Kansas City Chiefs, who are 14th, the Denver Broncos, 32nd. That's one that's on my mind. That's the fantasy semifinals, and that's one you could potentially be playing him in if we still don't see Ramondre. And then the Bills close things out, who are 19th. So some pretty decent matchups. The Steelers being one on this Thursday, and then the Broncos being one in a couple of weeks. What I like about Zeke and what has me interested in adding him is that we know that he's capable of being a 3-down back, whether it's catching passes out of the backfield, as he did last week with, I believe he had 40 receiving yards in that game, or it's being a guy that they can go to on early downs. And the Pats are a team that are targeting their running backs a ton. They have the 4th most on the season targets to their running back, so we know that this is a reliable piece of their offense that you can be grabbing onto. And Zeke is a guy that in previous seasons proved to be able to be a player that can convert goal line opportunities and score touchdowns. Now, again, a Patriots team that doesn't have a great offense, so the ceiling isn't really there, but I do think the floor is pretty solid because with the way the quarterback position, again, has gone for the Pats, you're probably going to see Zeke getting close to 20 touches here because I do believe their backup is going to be like Ty Montgomery. So very reliable, very high floor. Depends what you need. If you're needing floor, you need a running back to plug in. Zeke's the guy to add. If you're looking for ceiling, this probably isn't as enticing to you. Another injury here to pay attention to, going to Kenny Gainwell, 27% rostered. DeAndre Swift, if you're watching the tail end of that Niners-Eagles game, maybe you weren't with the blowout, but Swift took a really bad hit. I do think he's probably going to be in concussion protocol. The Cowboys are up this week, so a team that, great defense, not necessarily expecting a lot from Gainwell. I'm going to say that Gainwell, of the 3 running backs we're going to talk about, is probably my lowest priority out of the 3, but definitely still needs to be discussed behind this offense. The RB1 role for the Eagles is going to lead to 15-plus touches. We saw it for Gainwell when he was the RB1 for the Eagles in the first couple weeks of the season. He had 16 touches per game, but did fail to record double-digit fantasy points in both of those games, those first 2 weeks when he was the top option. But what we also know, and the reason why Gainwell wasn't able to put together big numbers as the top option, is Jalen Hurts and the tush-push stealing touchdowns. I mean, last season, Miles Sanders was such a great fantasy asset because he scored. DeAndre Swift isn't scoring. Kenny Gainwell's not scoring. These guys have, I think, maybe 6 total touchdowns on the season. Miles Sanders is getting into the double digits. So Gainwell is a player that I still do want to add because he's playing behind an offensive line that's one of the best in the league. He's playing with an offense that's one of the best in the league. There's still going to be opportunities to score, but you have to be able to take advantage of them. And guys like Gainwell and Swift have not necessarily done that so far this year, and they're leaning more on Jalen Hurts in his arm for good reason. So Gainwell is a guy that you can add, a guy that you could potentially be playing, but when I put together my running back rankings later this week and get it to you guys, I wouldn't expect to find him as, maybe he'll be a back-end RB2 for you, and that's something that you could get away with this week. Final running back. Need to talk about Ty Chandler again. We talked about it a couple weeks ago, and the Vikings coming off the bye, he could be forgotten because he's just 22% rostered right now. And he's more of the guy that I want to make the investment in to kind of stash. So Madison had his best game of the season last couple weeks ago now against the Bears on that Monday Night Football game. He averaged 5.2 yards per carry, so that kind of puts Chandler back into the backseat a little bit. He was definitely emerging. I felt like he was about to break out against the Bears there, but we saw Madison be a little bit more efficient. But despite the efficiency, he fumbled again, and that has been the big thing with this team and with O'Connell just very much stressing they need to take care of the football. So Madison can lose this job at a moment's notice. And I do think Chandler's the better back. I truly believe that. He just hasn't been great in pass protection. That's kind of hurt him. But looking at the schedule, this is why I want to make the investment. The Raiders this week, 26th in fantasy points allowed to running backs. The Bengals, 23rd, and then they get Detroit, 6th, not a matchup you want to play them in. And then the Green Bay Packers in the fantasy championship, who are 24th. If you see Chandler start to take over, I do think with Dobbs being the quarterback, the running volume, I know, is increased because of that. And I do think in that particular matchup, you could see some benefit from that. So that's something to keep in mind, that you could potentially feel good about Ty Chandler being a potential stash for you right now, just 22% rostered. A couple of wide receivers this week have some real intrigue. And the first one for me, another player coming off of his bye, Odell Beckham Jr. He's 39% rostered. I'm surprised he's still pretty widely available. I know for a lot of you guys, we're talking about some players that are above that 10, 15%, but I do find that in a lot of my leagues, these are players that have been added before, but have now been dropped. And so there's a decent chance they're available for a lot of you guys. Here's the thing, I'm really excited about Odell, because we saw it a couple of years ago with the Rams on their Super Bowl run where Odell really started to break out at the end of the season. I think I see that real potential here for Odell as well. So benefits significantly, I think, from the bye week, because I think it's very clear that he is banged up and he isn't 100%. So getting the 2 weeks here is going to be great. And the Ravens have kind of been protecting him the last 3 weeks. He's run just 12, 17, and 12 routes in those last 3 weeks. But despite that, he's still seen 13 targets over that 3-game span. Like, he hasn't been on the field a ton, but when he's on the field, he's getting the ball. And that bears itself out here throughout the entirety of the season, because it has a target rate above 22%. So that is, of course, a sample size we have that from the duration of the season tells me that this is a guy that when he's on the field, they're going to get the ball to him. And you look at some of these numbers in terms of the type of targets he's getting, and I really like what I'm seeing. Top 25 in end zone targets, again, despite the lack of routes run, but only 1 touchdown. So he's getting the ball in those important areas of the field. He hasn't quite converted those into touchdowns enough yet, but he could definitely do that. That's something that there's a little bit of a luck factor there too. He's top 25 in top 25 end zone targets, and then he's averaging 15.1 yards per reception, which is 23rd. So he's creating some explosives, and that's because his 12.9 yards in average depth of target is 26. So there's downfield looks, there's looks in the red zone, there's looks in the end zone, and I think there's an opportunity for this role for him to grow even further, because you're looking at a team that's going to be playing without Mark Andrews for the duration of the regular season, the duration of your fantasy season. And I do not think Isaiah Likely is anywhere near the player that Mark Andrews is, or capable of taking the target share that Mark Andrews has. We've seen that for just 1 week now. I think you get that out over the duration of the remaining games of their season, and you're going to see Odell Beckham Jr. breakout. So if he is available on your waiver wire, he is my number 1 ad on the week. Back to some of the injury news and how you're going to approach it with your fantasy team. Noah Brown, 40% rostered right now in fantasy football. Brutal fractured fibula injury from Tank Dell. You hate to see it, the way this offense has been moving throughout the last couple of weeks, and honestly, throughout the majority of this season. But we've seen Noah Brown step into a role as the wide receiver 2 in this offense with, Tank Dell missing time, with Nico Collins missing time, and he's performed in those opportunities. So I know this is a player that doesn't hold a lot of, draft pedigree, or a player that in his previous stint with the Cowboys was someone that was very relevant in fantasy. I do believe he will be very relevant throughout the remainder of this season, because it hasn't mattered who the opponent has been. The Texans have put points up, and it's because C.J. Stroud has been the best downfield passer in the entire league in his rookie season. The numbers bear that out. He has the second highest completion percentage. He has the second most completions of 20-plus air yards, 7 touchdowns, 0 interceptions on the deep ball, and 20.2 yards per attempt on these passes of 20-plus air yards, because he is completing them, and he is not just creating, gains of 20 yards, 40, 60, massive plays. You saw it from Nico Collins last week. So very comfortable with what Stroud is able to do for this offense. And Brown has seen 27.6% of his targets be targets of 20-plus air yards. That was like near a third of what his targets are coming on these big play opportunities. And he's converted them too. 8 deep targets, 7 of them caught. And he's turned that into 258 receiving yards. So Brown has a really, really massive opportunity here. I think he's the one to take advantage of it. I know maybe you're looking at a Robert Woods who gets on the field. I don't think I can trust him as the downfield target more than I can Brown, because that's where you're getting the value here, is the guys that can generate the big plays. And Brown has been proven capable of doing that throughout this season. And now he gets a huge opportunity rest of season. So definitely a really good ad for you. And finally, third wide receiver, and a player that I would say is probably one of my lowest priority ads this week, but still, I think for some of you guys, he's still going to be proving valuable. Elijah Moore. 43% rostered. Amari Cooper goes down with a concussion, going to be in the concussion protocol. We've seen the case for a lot of receivers not being able to come back, but we also have seen Chris Olave this past week was able to return. So maybe Cooper can play. So this is why that Moore is a little bit more of like a speculation type of ad, where I'm not as sure of what exactly will come through fruition here. But Moore with Cooper out of the picture did put together some good numbers: 10 targets, 4 receptions, 83 yards. And what needs to be discussed is the Joe Flacco situation in Cleveland. And what Joe Flacco brings to the table is downfield opportunities. Moore's average depth of target in this game was over 20 yards. Like, he is consistently, Flacco, pushing the ball downfield. You look at some of these numbers. He had 6 deep passes. Again, deep passes are 20-plus air yards. That was made up 13.6% of his attempts. If he did that throughout the rest of his starts, he'd rank 8th in the NFL in percentage of attempts being of 20-plus air yards. So we've got explosive plays available to us here with Joe Flacco, quarterback. Because, look, the legs are slow. He can barely move, but that arm is still lively. I'm shocked at how good he looked, even though it was obviously a game that the Browns did not win. But you look at the two matchups that come up next. You got the Jaguars and you got the Bears. Two teams that have proven capable of stopping the run and forcing teams to throw the football. Opponents are throwing the ball a ton against these two teams in particular. So we're going to see Flacco get the ball in his hands and throwing the football quite a bit in these two matchups. And that's going to be beneficial for all wide receivers, whether it's Elijah Moore, whether it's if Amari Cooper is back. I'm not completely sure. Honestly, I could see myself telling you if Cooper's healthy to start both of these guys, because again, the Jaguars are just so good against the run, and the Browns have not been the greatest running team ever since Chubb's injury at the start of the year. So Moore's going to be a decent ad. And if you're in a really deep league, I know I didn't talk about some really deep players to add, but if Cooper's out, Cedric Tillman ran the most routes on the team last week, and he was getting downfield targets as well. So I do think Moore is a talented player that could really benefit from this quarterback change that I think really benefits him in the passing game in general. Okay, those are my favorite players to add heading into week 14 of fantasy football. Guys, if you have questions about these players, or if there's anyone else you're considering to add this week as well, or players you're considering to drop, definitely drop those questions down below in the comment section. Like today's video if you did enjoy, and we will see you guys on the next one.